Nepal, for anyone who doesn't know, is a small landlocked country wedged between China and India. It's a place where literacy is only about 50%. Only about 50% of the people are literate, and that drops much lower in women, down to 30–40%. Life expectancy is only a bit over 50 years. 82% of people live on less than $2 a day. In the Human Development Index, it's ranked 144 out of 182. So it's one of the absolute most backward or underdeveloped countries on Earth, and the underdevelopment is pretty much across the country and very extreme. The history of Nepal started with in about 1768, or the sort of the modern nation of Nepal, modern nation state, with Narayan Prithvi Shah, who was a sort of warlord or sort of small feudal family in the sort of central west of Nepal. And he invaded Kathmandu and took over the Kathmandu Valley, and then sort of from that base sort of spread out and started to make himself a sort of feudal royal empire, which grew over the next few decades to become quite a substantial power in the northern sort of North India. As you can see here, quite bigger than the sort of Nepal of today. At the same time, there was another sort of power growing on the subcontinent, being the British East India Company. And the two sort of were growing sort of side by side up until naturally they came to conflict in 1814, which resulted in the Gorkha War, where while the Nepalese were never fully conquered or totally defeated by the British, they did suffer substantial losses, and in the end of the peace treaty that was signed, the Sagali Treaty, the Nepalese lost a significant amount of their land, and the British Empire expanded, or the British East India Company expanded. And sort of from this point, the nature of Nepal sort of changed. It was no longer a sort of a fiefdom in its own, a kingdom in its own right, sort of expanding with a relatively prosperous economy. It had previously had trade routes across the Himalayas that were quite valuable. However, they became sort of less and less important as the British developed trade across the sea, and India became much more of a raw material export market sort of thing. So from 1816, Nepal really sort of became what you would say today sort of similar to a neo-colony. It maintained its outward independence and was never conquered by the British, but it became increasingly dependent on the British role. There was a British resident in Kathmandu who increasingly became more powerful. And Nepal's relationship with Britain became very much subservient. It became a nation that would send troops into India to help put down rebellions against the British and keep a secure border to the north of Britain. So yeah, essentially from 1816, Nepal has very much been under the thumb of essentially imperialism, namely British, but yeah. If you skip through this sort of relationship, remained relatively unquestioned up until the 1940s, when in India there was the democracy movement and independence movement against the British Raj. The British in India sort of grew, and those radical ideas of democracy and independence and anti-imperialism flowed on into Nepal. This slide's a little bit void now. They were sort of some key central figures in the Nepali Congress Party, which was founded in 1947. But yeah, in 1947 the Nepali Congress Party was founded based on the Indian Congress Party. Again, it was largely by sort of people from with moneyed interests within Nepal, but were sort of more liberal and more looking to modernise Nepal. And in 1950 they launched an armed uprising against the monarchy and the aristocratic system. This had a lot of popular support. There were the insurgency in the south from India got a lot of successes against the royalist sort of military. There was popular uprisings in Kathmandu and other places, and generally the popular sort of support and pressure led to a compromise being figured out in 1951 called the Delhi Compromise, signed in New Delhi, where the Congress Party and the aristocracy and the monarchy in Nepal signed a sort of deal, whereas the monarchy wasn't removed, but its power was limited, and there was a sort of power sharing deal, and there was meant to be elections to a constituent assembly later that year, or within 2 years, I think was the initial sort of thing. But the Congress Party sort of always held back from this and never sort of made an effort to wind down the popular support to get itself into bureaucratic sort of positions to try and change the nature of things from within and peacefully. And because of this, because they sort of wound down the popular support, it just played into the hands of the monarchy. In the end, the elections were postponed and then never eventuated, and in 1959 the monarchy decreed a constitution. There were elections, but they to a very meaningless sort of rubber stamp sort of parliament, but that was even dissolved in 1962, and all political parties were then banned. And essentially it was because the popular support that was there wasn't was allowed to and encouraged to sort of dissipate and to fall away. And then the demands of the popular sort of movement of land reform and economic reforms and political reforms, namely being a constituent assembly, were never realised. Around the same time, there was a communist party founded in Nepal. It was sort of mainly on the margins, initially had some sort of support, but however after the repression and things, it did, as communist parties and left parties have a tendency to do, and it split and split again. And this is sort of a map of all the various splits and unifications, and then multiple more splits and whatever else. So yeah, there was no effective sort of movement to mobilise or popular support from the left either. So for the next sort of 3 decades, from sort of 62 up until probably the 80s, there wasn't a whole lot of resistance to the royal rule. However, in the 80s, there was like the student population had sort of grown, and again there was a sort of recultivation of radical ideas, whisperings for democratic changes, and it started to arise again and get sort of popularity. And sort of mirrored with this, there was both a rejuvenation of the Nepali Congress Party, but also there was a unification of parties to the more left of spectrum that would sort of eventuated in the Communist Party of Nepal, United Marxist-Leninists. From here I'll refer to as the UML. And sort of with having a more unified sort of leftist movement and the sort of traditional Democrats and a more militant sort of population, this led in 1990 to the Jana Andolan, which it means in Nepal is the people's movement. Again, we had the same calls of land reform, of modernisation, of a constituent assembly in particular played a very key role of all this in these movements. But again, the UML, despite its name, never really sought to push the popular demands and the popular movement through to the realisation of those demands. It was allowed for, again, a compromise to be figured out between the palace and the movement, whereas the new constitution was drafted by a sort of a committee of royalists and supposed Democrats, and the two major parties, the Nepali Congress Party and the UML, sort of became your Tory and your Labour Party, essentially, in what they had a multi-party democratic system, democracy system, but in many ways it was often even less representative than the royalist system, the post-90 scenario. So there was never, again, the movement raised the demands of institutional change, of real revolutionary change, but because the leadership wasn't there, it was sort of prevented from the realisation of that. But during this time there was also again, reunification to the left, but this time on the hard left, the revolutionary left, which initially came together in the Communist Party of Nepal Unity Centre, which later became the Maoist. The Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist. Initially they were to the sort of on the fringes of the movement during Jana Andolan, but they consistently took up the demands of constituent assembly, of more fundamental change, of the rights of different ethnic groups and nationalities, of multiple different issues that were sort of glossed over and lost after the movement subsided. Initially they ran in elections, and in 1992 and 94 they were the third biggest force in the parliament, the Maoist party and the Maoist sort of movement, but still much smaller, but again within parliament consistently pushed for more fundamental changes, for a better representation of more the institutions, and pushed for the demands of the original Jana Andolan in 1990. In 1994 or 5, I believe, sorry, my notes, in 1996 they published 40-point demands on the government, calling for some immediate action on relatively basic demands, such as Nepal should be declared a secular state. The army administration needs to be under more popular control. The rights of the king need to be, the special rights of the king need to be wound back. Multiple things like that, gender equality, relatively seemingly basic things, but that again sort of took up a lot of the demands that had been sort of forgotten and not achieved. And sort of said if action wasn't taken on this, then they would go to the countryside and launch a people's war. And as the system in place wasn't particularly responsive to these sort of demands, they did launch a people's war in February 13, 1996.